The galaxy had lived in a fragile peace for centuries. The great alliances and federations had learned to coexist in an ever-expanding universe. Their ships traversed the stars with the kind of assuredness that only peace could bring, but everything changed in an instant when the strange ship appeared on the edge of known space. No one knew where it had come from, no one could trace its origins. It was just there, a massive silhouette hanging in the void. Its shape was unlike any craft ever seen before, its hull dark and imposing, its energy signature silent and unreadable. The galaxy's greatest fleets scrambled to understand it. Commanders met in secret with intelligence officers, hoping to form some kind of strategy, but nothing worked. They could not even begin to approach the ship, let alone identify what kind of technology it used. It was like a ghostly monolith floating in space, an enigma that no one could crack. For days the ship sat in the same spot, offering no communication, offering no threat, and yet every observer felt an undeniable sense of danger. Something in the very air felt wrong, as if the universe itself had shifted at its presence. Whispers spread across the galaxy. The ship was a harbinger, a sign of something much worse yet to come. In the great capital of the United Fleets, a council was called to deliberate what should be done against this new unknown. The brightest minds in the galaxy gathered to discuss options for containment or even defense. The political leaders of every faction argued among themselves. Some called for caution, others wanted immediate action, and yet no one could agree on the next steps. The fear of the unknown ran deep and clouded their judgment. After several days of debate, the decision was made. A fleet of 10,000 ships was to be dispatched to investigate the unknown ship. It was a bold and decisive move, the kind of action that had always been successful in the past. When dealing with hostile forces, the fleet would approach the strange vessel with caution at first, but if it showed any sign of aggression, the order was clear: fire first and ask questions later. The fleet launched with impressive speed, thousands of ships descending from different corners of the galaxy, converging on the unknown ship. They arrived at the coordinates, and what they saw made every commander hesitate for just a moment. The sheer size of the enemy vessel was incomprehensible. It dwarfed their ships in ways that seemed almost surreal. No one could wrap their minds around it, and as they began to form a battle formation, the realization sank in. The unknown ship was not moving, it was waiting for them. Messages were sent to the fleet commanders, but all of them came back with the same chilling message. No communication was received from the unknown vessel. It was silent and unyielding. The fleet moved forward, but something held them back, their weapons ready, but their hands trembling in uncertainty. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered as a single shot fired from the unknown ship. It came with the speed of a collapsing star and the force of a supernova. The impact was immediate and devastating. Entire ships evaporated in an instant. Nothing remained of them but the faint trace of their destruction, and as the remaining fleet tried to recover, another wave of fire came, and this time the survivors had no time to react. Their ships were obliterated one by one. The horror was beyond anything they had ever known. The unknown ship remained still, silent as ever, while the galaxy's fleets were reduced to rubble. The destruction of the fleet echoed through the galaxy like a tremor that rattled the foundations of everything. The galactic powers had built for centuries. They had been unified in peace, but now a darkness had arrived, something far beyond their understanding. The remaining ships from the ill-fated fleet drifted in the wake of annihilation. A handful of survivors were scattered across the void, but none could offer any explanation, none could offer any hope. The fleet had been wiped out in moments by a single shot. In the wake of the massacre, a cold silence fell across the galaxy's command centers. Diplomats and military strategists raced to analyze the debris, but every attempt to learn about the unknown ship was in vain. It was as though their enemies had simply vanished without a trace. Their technologies left behind were alien beyond belief. No one had ever seen anything like it. No one could even begin to understand the nature of the weapon that had torn apart their fleet in an instant. A council was called once more, but this time there was no debate, no hesitation. The galaxy's powers knew now that they were dealing with something far worse than any threat they had faced before. Their response was swift and decisive. A new coalition was formed, the largest armada the galaxy had ever seen. A force of more than 50,000 warships would be assembled, each one carrying the finest weapons and soldiers from every corner of the known universe. They would strike at the unknown ship with everything they had, every available resource, would be committed to one final battle. This time they would not fail. The fleet surged toward the position of the unknown ship, faster than anything they had ever moved before they arrived with a roar of engines. As the vast armada loomed in the distance, the unknown ship remained still just as it had before, not a single sign of movement or aggression, only a cold, unblinking presence in the void of space. Its silence felt as threatening as any weapon. The first salvo was fired, a coordinated barrage of energy blasts from the United Fleet, targeting the massive vessel all at once. For a moment, it seemed as though the unknown ship might be overwhelmed. But then a strange thing happened. The energy blasts began to deflect harmlessly off its hull. It was as if the ship wasn't even bothered by their attacks. The shields of the unknown ship absorbed the energy like a sponge, and then returned fire with terrifying precision. In an instant, the Armada's front line was torn apart. The battleships that had taken the brunt of the blast were reduced to drifting wreckage, their remains illuminated by the bright flash of the explosion. It was impossible to fathom the sheer power that had just been unleashed in the blink of an eye. The first wave of the fleet was already gone. Panic set in as the rest of the fleet tried to regroup, but the unknown ship responded faster than they could react. It unleashed a barrage of weapons that cracked through the ranks like a deadly storm. Entire sections of the fleet were wiped out in seconds. No mercy, no hesitation. Every ship in the path of the unknown ship's firepower was eradicated, no matter the size, no matter the strength. They were all torn to pieces with effortless efficiency. The surviving ships attempted evasive maneuvers, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The unknown ship seemed to predict their every move, anticipating their strategies and countering them before they could even be executed. The remaining commanders issued desperate commands to retreat, but the unknown ship didn't allow it. The galaxy's finest warriors found themselves fleeing from an enemy they could not understand or defeat. In the aftermath, the fleet was shattered, the vast armada now reduced to nothing more than drifting debris. No one had lived to tell the tale of what had just happened. Only silence remained as the unknown ship lingered at the edge of known space, its weapons quiet once more, leaving only the terrible memory of what it had done. The galaxy stood in shock. The greatest military force it had ever assembled lay in ruins, and not a single ship had returned to tell the tale of the unknown ship's fury. Fear had swept across every corner of known space, and panic sat in the remaining fleets, scattered in all directions, desperately trying to regroup and plan. But each faction knew deep down that they were powerless against this new threat. The invader was not just strong, it was beyond their comprehension. The sheer destruction it had wrought left no room for doubt. There was no hope of matching its power. In every council chamber across the galaxy, debates raged, but no plan could be made that didn't feel like a death sentence. Every possible strategy was considered, from using smaller, more agile ships to laying traps and ambushes, but the enemy's technology was so far advanced that no one could predict how it would respond. The Deathworlders, as they had now come to be known, were a force that defied everything the galaxy had come to understand about war. As the galaxy reeled from the loss of entire fleets, small groups of survivors began to piece together the nature of their enemy from the wreckage left behind. Some managed to salvage pieces of technology, though it was mostly indecipherable even for their most brilliant minds. Some theorized that the Deathworlders ship wasn't merely a weapon of war, but a part of their very identity, that it was connected to their very being, to their survival instinct itself. The Deathworlders were not invaders. They were warriors in the truest sense of the word. They had conquered not just through force, but through an unyielding drive to survive in a universe that was constantly trying to kill them. Soon whispers began to spread about a plan to find the key to defeating the Deathworlders, something that could turn the tide in their favor, something that might exploit the unknown weaknesses of their ship. But these rumors were fleeting and filled with uncertainty, as none of the surviving ships had been able to decipher any of the captured technology. It seemed like an impossible task. Meanwhile, the Deathworlders continued their slow march through the galaxy. They took nothing from the systems they invaded except total control. Their ships remained mostly still, hovering like ghosts over the occupied worlds, and though they showed no signs of aggression, they didn't need to. The sheer presence of their battleship was enough to cause entire systems to submit in fear. With every passing day, the pressure to resolve the crisis grew as more and more star systems fell under the shadow of the Deathworlders. Their silent presence loomed over the galaxy like a storm waiting to break. Many star systems found themselves facing an impossible choice: either submit to the will of the Deathworlders or risk total annihilation. But even those who surrendered quickly found no peace. The Deathworlders offered no promises, no negotiations, only control. In the midst of this mounting dread, a new council was called, but this time, it was not just the military strategists or the generals who attended. The galaxy's most influential diplomats and peacekeepers arrived as well. The gravity of the situation demanded an urgent diplomatic response, but many wondered if there was even a way to reach the Deathworlders, and if there was, what terms could possibly be offered that would prevent further bloodshed. As the council convened, two factions emerged. Some argued that diplomacy was the only path forward, that they must at least try to understand the Deathworlders' motives and perhaps strike some kind of deal. Others believed that any form of negotiation was futile, that their only hope lay in organizing another counteroffensive. But after the defeat of their combined fleets, few still held hope that war could succeed. Amidst these heated debates, a new voice entered the conversation, an envoy from a distant species, a race of beings known for their deep understanding of alien cultures, offered a unique perspective. Their representatives had observed the Deathworlders from afar, and through some sort of empathic analysis, they believed that the Deathworlders were not inherently malicious. Rather, they were motivated by an instinct to protect their homeworld from an unforgiving galaxy, a planet so hostile that only the strongest could survive. Such a world bred warriors of the highest caliber, driven by a relentless desire to ensure their survival in the face of overwhelming odds. The diplomats spoke of their own encounters with the Deathworlders, claiming that the species had offered peaceful resolutions before, though they never communicated through traditional methods. Instead, they spoke through actions. Their gestures were not ones of malice, but of power, to show that they were the dominant force in the galaxy, not to conquer but to survive. For some, this interpretation seemed to make sense. It was not conquest they sought, but survival at any cost. They were driven by a primal need to endure, to take control of the galaxy simply because it had become a place too dangerous for them to exist in peace. Yet, the question remained, could the galaxy truly afford to let such a force roam unchecked? Could they negotiate with beings who had already shown their power by wiping out entire fleets without mercy? Many questioned whether surrender was a better option than continued resistance. After all, the Deathworlders' strength seemed limitless, and any attempt at defiance was met with overwhelming force. A handful of galaxy leaders pushed forward with the notion of sending envoys to the Deathworlders' ship to propose a truce. A formal delegation would seek the opportunity to open a line of communication in hopes that the Deathworlders would reveal their true intentions. Perhaps an agreement could be reached that would spare the galaxy from further bloodshed. However, others pushed back fiercely. They saw the Deathworlders as a terrifying threat, not a force to be reasoned with, and to show any sign of weakness would invite even greater destruction. They argued that the galaxy must stand firm, show resilience, and never bow to such overwhelming power for fear that they would lose all semblance of control. And so, the galaxy was torn between two paths: diplomacy or destruction, both fraught with peril and uncertainty. No one knew which would lead to salvation and which would lead to their ultimate demise. Yet, as the debates raged on, one fact became undeniable. Time was running out, and the galaxy's fate hung in the balance. In the days that followed, the galaxy's leaders found themselves trapped between two unthinkable choices: the slow death of submission or the brutal, all-or-nothing gamble of a counterattack. No amount of diplomacy, no matter how carefully crafted, had managed to reach the Deathworlders. Their vessel remained an immovable monolith of silence. The words of the peace faction grew quieter as the deaths of entire colonies mounted, and the resistance movement began to grow in secret. In the dark corners of the galaxy, pockets of survivors who had lost everything began to plan their revenge. They had nothing left to lose, and the destruction of their worlds had left them with only one unshakable resolve to strike back with everything they had, even if it meant throwing themselves into certain annihilation. Military leaders in these resistance cells began working on a coordinated counteroffensive that would finally force the Deathworlders to acknowledge the galaxy's defiance. It was a desperate plan, a full-force attack on the Deathworlders' battleship. Using the last of the galaxy's remaining fleets, they would throw their combined might at the enemy. More ships, more firepower than ever before, hoping that sheer numbers and an unexpected strike would overwhelm the Deathworlders' superior technology. The fleet would hit them with everything: missiles, plasma waves, antimatter cannons, everything they could muster in a final, do-or-die effort to destroy the Deathworlders' ship before it could finish claiming the galaxy. The resistance was not without its complications. The fleets that remained after the earlier defeats were fractured, scattered, and weakened. Morale was at an all-time low. Soldiers spoke of their fear of facing an enemy they could not even begin to understand. Entire fleets had been obliterated in seconds, leaving only cold space in their wake. Now, they were asked to believe that this final strike, this all-out counteroffensive, would somehow succeed. As the coalition gathered its forces, tensions were high. No one dared to voice their doubts, but the uncertainty gnawed at every mind. They did not even know if their weapons would have any effect on the Deathworlders' ship. Would they finally find a weakness, or would they once again be crushed under the weight of an unstoppable foe? The fleet assembled at the far reaches of the galaxy, the last remaining armada of united species. It was a strange collection of ships, some elegant, others rugged and battle-worn, each representing a species that had survived this long by the grace of their ancestors. Now, they fought not just for survival, but for the survival of their way of life. The entire fleet's existence had been reduced to a single mission: break the Deathworlders' hold and reclaim their galaxy from the grasp of an alien force. The fleet approached the Deathworlders' ship cautiously, keeping their distance as they prepared to launch their assault. It was a tense silence that hung in the air. The black ship was still there, floating silently in the void as if waiting for them, mocking their every move. The unity of the galaxy's forces felt fragile in that moment, but despite the fear, there was also a sense of determination. No matter the cost, they had to act. Finally, the order was given, and the first wave of ships surged forward, their weapons fired in perfect synchrony. A deadly storm aimed at the heart of the Deathworlders' vessel. The space around them shimmered as the concentrated firepower collided with the ship's shields, but to their horror, the shields absorbed the energy with terrifying ease. The sheer scale of the defense systems was beyond their comprehension. The Deathworlders' response came instantly. The ship began to move with a speed that seemed impossible. Its weapons, until then dormant, roared to life and cut through the attacking ships like a scythe through wheat. In moments, the first line of the fleet was shattered. The remaining ships tried to evade, but the Deathworlders' fire was relentless and precise. Every countermeasure they tried only seemed to feed the storm of destruction. In an instant, the resistance fleet was in chaos. Ships scattered in all directions, their crews fighting desperately to evade the incoming waves of destruction. But there was no escape. The Deathworlders' battleship moved as one, its weapons calculating and unyielding. The remaining forces of the galaxy watched in horror as their final counteroffensive was crushed before it could even gain traction. Desperation turned to terror as they realized there was no way to win, no chance to survive. This was not a fight for control of the galaxy, it was a fight for their very existence, and with every passing second, the hope of victory grew dimmer. In the aftermath of the failed counterattack, the remnants of the galaxy's united fleets limped away from the battlefield. Scattered and broken, the once proud forces now drifted like leaves caught in a storm, their morale shattered by the crushing defeat. The Deathworlders' ship hung like an eternal shadow over them, unmoving but always present, its presence a constant reminder of how small and powerless the galaxy had become in the face of such overwhelming force. The news of the fleet's destruction spread like wildfire across the galaxy systems that had once been part of the Great Federations now found themselves isolated and fearful. Each new day brought with it the realization that there was no safe place anymore. The Deathworlders had shown no interest in occupying these systems, at least not directly. Instead, they left a lingering feeling of dread, a reminder that anyone who resisted would be met with swift and unrelenting retribution. Entire worlds that had attempted to fight back found themselves burned to ashes, their populations wiped out without mercy. The survivors who managed to escape could only carry with them the memory of what had been lost. In some sectors, this terror led to widespread panic. Entire colonies began evacuating, fleeing to the farthest reaches of space, hoping to escape the Deathworlders' watchful gaze. The galaxy had never known such a sense of helplessness, and the cracks began to show in the fabric of its society. Fear seeped into every corner of existence, turning former allies against each other as suspicion and paranoia festered. A desperate few began to contemplate surrender, believing it to be the only way to save their people, to avoid total annihilation. But those who still held hope of resistance knew that surrender would be a death sentence just as much as defiance had been. The galaxy had no more choices left but to bow to the overwhelming power that stood above them. And so, in the shadows of their former glory, the leaders of the galaxy met once more, each trying to navigate the fragile peace that seemed to be the only way forward. One faction after another fell, unable to withstand the pressure of the Deathworlders' threat. Others held out a little longer, but every day saw their numbers dwindling, and as more and more systems capitulated, the galaxy's response grew weaker and more fragmented. For some, the thought of surrender was unbearable. The legacy of their species, the centuries of progress and discovery, seemed to be slipping away in a tide of fear and hopelessness. But what choice did they have? To fight was to face utter destruction, and for what? To prove that they had not surrendered to the inevitable. No. The galaxy's leaders were forced to consider the reality that the Deathworlders had broken them, had driven them into a corner from which there was no escape. But even as the galaxy's power crumbled, the Deathworlders did not relent. Their presence was as constant as the stars themselves. Unyielding and indifferent to the cries of the defeated, they made no demands, offered no threats. They simply waited, a dark reminder that they held the power to shape the galaxy's future on their own terms. And yet, in their silence, the galaxy could feel the weight of their dominance pressing down with every passing moment. Then the final message came. Though no one knew where it had originated from, it was simple, direct, and without mercy. Submit or be erased. That was the only choice left for the surviving worlds of the galaxy, and for the first time since their creation, the Great Federations, the alliances, and the armies of the galaxy understood that their time had passed. Their will had been broken by a species they could not understand nor defeat. The price of defiance had been high, and the galaxy was now paying it in full. Survival at the mercy of the Deathworlders was the only path that remained. The news of the Deathworlders' ultimatum spread quickly throughout the galaxy, igniting waves of fear and uncertainty, even among the most hardened warriors and politicians who had fought so fiercely against the idea of surrender. Now found themselves questioning everything. Their civilizations had fought for the thought of submitting to a force that had shown no mercy, no interest in compromise. Seemed like the ultimate betrayal. But with every passing day, the options grew slimmer and slimmer. The death toll continued to rise, and the last vestiges of hope began to crumble. As the once proud fleets of the galaxy disbanded, fractured into smaller factions, and abandoned their cause, the Deathworlders did not press for an immediate resolution. They did not need to. They waited patiently, their ship still looming at the edge of known space, a constant reminder of their unstoppable might. Some systems that had been the first to fall were already in the process of establishing their new lives under the rule of the Deathworlders' silent dominance, unsure of what would come next, but certain that resistance was futile. Despite the overwhelming sense of despair, there remained a handful of planets, a small fraction of survivors, that refused to give up entirely. They began organizing in secret, Continuing their fight from the shadows, they had seen what had happened to those who had surrendered, and they refused to let their people fall under the Deathworlders' reign without one last attempt to change their fate. These small resistance groups began to operate as guerrilla cells, spreading across the outer rim of the galaxy, attempting to strike back in any way they could, but the Deathworlders' presence in the galaxy was so pervasive that even these small acts of defiance seemed hopeless. Their ships moved with precision, responding to any disturbance with immediate force. The technology and tactics they wielded were beyond anything the galaxy had ever encountered, and the chances of success for these resistance fighters seemed like a fool's dream. But still, some clung to that dream. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for the idea of a galaxy that could remain free, for the memory of what had once been, and the possibility that someday there might be a way to defeat the Deathworlders and reclaim their lost worlds, even if the odds seemed impossible. Meanwhile, in the heart of the galaxy, the systems that had already surrendered were beginning to fall into a grim new normal. The Deathworlders' rule was not a brutal occupation, but a quiet, all-encompassing control. They imposed their presence on every level, from government to society, monitoring every system and ensuring that no resistance could grow unchecked. Those who cooperated with their new masters were spared, given the illusion of autonomy, while those who resisted were erased in a way that left no trace. The Deathworlders showed no interest in ruling with cruelty, but with efficiency. Their ships no longer fired on civilian populations unless provoked. They didn't need to. They controlled the very essence of life in the galaxy, shaping entire civilizations by making their survival depend on their compliance. Systems of communication were restructured to ensure there were no secrets, no hidden resistance movements, and those who even whispered rebellion were eliminated before they could ever act. It was a quiet reign, a rule that bent not with whips but with the weight of inevitability. The galaxy's inhabitants had learned quickly that survival came at the cost of their will to resist, and so a new order began to emerge slowly but surely. The remnants of the once great civilizations adapted to the new reality. Those that didn't quickly faded into oblivion. For some, the shift was unrecognizable. They lived under a different kind of tyranny, one that wasn't oppressive in its immediate cruelty, but in the overwhelming certainty that it could never be overcome. There were no more battles to fight, no more alliances to form. The Deathworlders were the new galaxy-wide power, and everyone else simply had to learn to live in its shadow. And though the resistance still lingered in the fringes of the galaxy, their numbers were dwindling, and the cost of fighting back had never been higher. They had lost far too much already, and each day, fewer believed that the deathless juggernaut of the Deathworlders could be stopped. Yet, even in this hopeless situation, the embers of defiance still burned in the hearts of a few who refused to accept that the galaxy would ever truly belong to the Deathworlders. Years passed, and the Deathworlders' reign stretched across the galaxy like a cold, unyielding tide. Their ships, silent and impenetrable, patrolled the stars, ensuring that no insurrection would rise again under their watch. Entire sectors fell under their influence, and in those regions, life went on as it always had, albeit with a new, distant hand guiding it. The Deathworlders' presence an ever-constant reminder that their survival was secured by the invaders' will. Yet, despite the apparent dominance of this new order, something remained within the hearts of the galaxy's remaining rebels, something that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hopeless the cause seemed. Hope. They were not completely beaten yet. There was still resistance, still the faint whisper of defiance in the darkest corners of space. The galaxy's survivors, scattered and broken, had not completely given up the fight. One such group, a coalition of outcasts, dissidents, and renegades from all corners of the galaxy, had gathered in secret on a hidden world at the galaxy's edge. They were the last remnants of the old resistance, and though they were small, they had one thing that none of the Deathworlders' forces could match: knowledge of the invaders' weaknesses. For years, these fighters had painstakingly studied the few remnants of the Deathworlders' technology that had been captured, including fragments of their battle strategies and tactics. Slowly, methodically, they had begun to uncover the threads that wove the Deathworlders' power together. The key, that they believed, lay in understanding the invaders' true motives. Not just their need to conquer, but their need to survive. There was something about their biology, their evolution, that could be exploited if they could discover it. They might have the means to challenge the Deathworlders once and for all. And so, a daring plan was set in motion. Their best scientists and tacticians, working in the shadows, had developed a strategy, one that would put their lives at risk, but one that offered a glimmer of hope. The galaxy's last fleet, a fleet not of vast armadas, but of stealthy, agile ships, would strike deep into the heart of the Deathworlders' occupied space. They would infiltrate the core of their empire, learn more about their weaknesses, and if they were lucky, find a way to disrupt the Deathworlders' control of the galaxy. It was a dangerous gamble, but the Resistance had no other choice. They had been pushed to the brink for too long, and the galaxy's once great civilizations were now shadows of themselves. Broken and divided, they had no future unless they dared to take this final stand. The fleet moved silently, hidden in the shadow of asteroid fields and uncharted nebulae. Their ships were built for stealth, not power. They had no intention of directly confronting the Deathworlders' battleship. They knew their chances of defeating it were slim. They simply needed to reach the heart of the enemy's territory, to gather enough information to launch a real strike against them, and perhaps, finally, find a way to break their stranglehold on the galaxy. As they approached the heart of the Deathworlders' dominion, they could feel the weight of every decision made before them. The galaxy had been brought to its knees, and now, as the fleet slipped into the shadow of the Deathworlders' immense stronghold, it was clear that this mission would either mark the end of all resistance or the beginning of a new war. A war for freedom, for survival, for the future of the galaxy itself. But as the first ship entered the outer defenses, something unexpected happened. The Deathworlders' ship did not immediately respond. Their weapons remained dormant. Their sensors did not sweep the area. It was as if they were allowing the Resistance fleet to pass by unhindered at first. This gave the rebels hope. They had anticipated a swift counterattack, but now they were confronted with an uncomfortable silence, the kind that precedes something far worse. And then, as they neared the heart of the enemy's empire, the truth became clear. The Deathworlders had been watching them the entire time. The fleet had been bait in a larger game, and their every move had been anticipated. Every decision they had made played into the Deathworlders' hands. The Resistance fleet had unknowingly stepped into a trap. The final battle had begun, not with a bang, but with the silence of a galaxy still trying to survive.